Roger Johnson, President, National Farmers Union.
Appreciate you joining us here today. And this is kind of going to be a 2-for-1 for a lot of audience members out there, where we're going to do a little bit of a social issue that has some severity behind it. And then we're going to transition into a relationship between ag and energy and that history there. And who knows, we might even venture into the brave new world of technology. I mean, drones, ag, energy, it all seems to be intersecting. But Mr. Roger Johnson, how are you doing today?
I'm doing very well, Jason. It's good to be with you.
Well, I appreciate you coming on here. And before we get into the severity of the we'll call it an epidemic right now. Actually, that's probably the most literally correct word, which is happening in the world of agriculture in terms of the human beings behind agriculture. Can you give us a little bit of your background? Because your background is going to really set the table of why you have so much knowledge in this, because you've served at the highest level of that an agriculture commissioner can serve at in the United States. So talk to me a little bit about your experience as ag commissioner and some of those things.
Yeah, so I grew up on a family farm in the middle of North Dakota that my grandfather homesteaded. I farmed that most of my life, and while I was doing that, I was also it's important for part of this to understand that in the 80s, which were a very difficult period for agriculture, I worked as a farm credit counselor and sat down with farmers who were having trouble paying bills and worked on budgets for them, and then went in and met with their lenders and worked out solutions that were better than a bankruptcy or a foreclosure. That was kind of what we were there to do. And then after that, and I farmed during this time, so that was kind of a part-time job. Then eventually I was elected as North Dakota's Commissioner of Agriculture, served a dozen years, and now I've been out in Washington, D.C. for the last 9 years as President of National Farmers Union. The last couple of years that I was Agriculture Commissioner, I also was involved in the leadership of NASDA, the National Association of State Departments of Agriculture, eventually serving as president of that organization. And so we kind of have our fingers in everything related to agriculture.
Yeah, and we talked about the human side of things, and that's where we're going to go right now, because the bullet point is suicide rates for farmers have more than doubled of veterans. I mean, when I saw that headline, that grabs you, because, of course, the suicide rate of veterans gets all the headlines.
Yeah.
And we're not talking about importance here or trying to rank them, but it's a shocking headline. So talk to me a little bit about more than just the headline. What's going on out there?
Sure. Well, you kind of need to start, I think, with the economic stress. But there are lots of stressors in agriculture. But let me talk about the economics first. In the last 5 years, net farm income, on average, in the U.S. has dropped by more than 50%. That's a dramatic decrease in net farm income. Net farm income, in fact, the median net farm income this year, meaning half of all the farmers are above, half of all the farmers are below, median net farm income this year is projected to be a negative $1,300. So those folks who say, I have a job so I can farm, for many of them, that is literally absolutely true. And so the economics are very difficult right now for farmers. And, prices have collapsed by about 50% in that 4 or 5 year time frame as well. But it's not just that. I mean, family farmers in particular, they have sort of the weight of family generations before them who've always been on the farm, have been successful. Now they're struggling. There's been the stress of all these things that are outside of your control. It's the weather, it's the markets. Those are the two really big things that you have very little control over You don't have any control over markets. You have some control over how you market. But if the market never presents a profitable price, that's obviously a lot of stress. And so you've just got a lot of stressors. And on top of that, we are now in a real crisis with opioids in agriculture. Zippy Duvall, who's the president of the American Farm Bureau Federation, and I, as the president of the National Farmers Union, got together and decided we were going to work jointly on this problem because it's such a big problem in agriculture. We started by commissioning a survey. And here's the really interesting information on that survey. Most people think that drug problems are predominantly an inner city problem. That's certainly what I always thought, because growing up, that's what it was. That's no longer the case. In fact, rural America has a larger per capita basis opioid addiction problem than urban America. In rural America, half of all respondents in this survey said that they were directly impacted in one way or another by the opioid addiction. They were addicted themselves, someone in their family, maybe someone who was in their very close circle of friends or acquaintances. In that group, a subset of rural America are farmers and ranchers. Farmers, in the survey, 74% of them, so 3/4 of all farmers, are directly impacted. Themselves, a family member, someone who works on that farm, they know or they are directly impacted by the opioid problem. And it's a really, really big problem. And I would argue that in a lot of ways that opioid addiction problem is another huge stressor that leads to suicide. It might be an overdose, but frankly, the overdoses, I don't think get counted in the suicide numbers. But you can imagine if you've got a family member who is addicted and you just got this enormous stress surrounding it. So the interesting statistic that you mentioned at the beginning, Jason, about farmer suicide rate being higher than for veteran suicide rates, farmer suicide rates are 5 times that of the general population. So it's a really, really big problem, and it's something that we're trying to focus on. Zippy and I have joined up with Ann Hazlett, who is in charge of this at USDA. She reports directly to Secretary Perdue. And we're doing a number of sessions around the country to sort of bring awareness to this problem. And we're working to get help through Congress in different ways. There's likely going to be a piece in the Farm Bill. There are pieces in other appropriations that have come out. We're going to do what we can to try and address this crisis in rural America.
So as I was listening to you talk, I was making some notes, and of course I wrote down the 80s and then of course depression, because the suicide rate in agriculture, like other industries, obviously goes a lot with the different economic cycles of recessions and depressions. Well, then you started getting into the opioid addiction, and that's a wild card. And so, here we got this new world where everyone's trying to find new leadership and have a new outlook on life. Are there any other wild cards that we should be looking for? Because, a lot of people, it's easy to dismiss it with recessionary times and blame it on the low wheat prices and corn prices. But when you start talking about addiction and things along those nature, any other signs, I guess, that friends, family members should be looking out for?
Well, there are. In fact, you should go to nfu.org, and then there's a link to what we call Farm Town Strong. You can go directly to Farm Town Strong I think it's org. and there's a website that we've developed with Farmers Union that provide a whole list of resources. Some of those indications you should look for. Obviously, if people are kind of withdrawing, if they're, if they're acting in a different way, if money becomes a real problem, because if you're addicted to opioids, you're having to buy them usually at some place, and then you probably are having a hard time holding down a job. So that's another one of those indicators. And just be aware. Look for something that's different. Talk to folks. If it's in your family, you probably can figure that out. But if it's like someone who you know well and you aren't always communicating with, spend more time. One of the things that we think is a positive way for agriculture to deal with this issue is that we have such a proud tradition of helping folks, helping neighbors when somebody has a heart attack or somebody died or there was a major accident that occurred. The neighbors get together and they'll put in the crop, or they'll take the crop off, or they'll, whatever. You've got some, but the opioid problem isn't quite as obvious as someone having a heart attack and going into the hospital, or someone dying, or these kinds of things. But they need the same kind of response, and so it used to be growing up, there was so much more community involved in agriculture, and as we've lost farmers, as rural communities have sort of atrophied along the way, lost population, the economic circumstances become more difficult, not just in agriculture but in rural communities. That sort of community togetherness in a lot of places across the country has reduced for lots of reasons. We're encouraging folks to try and bring that back. Hold community events, whether it's whatever you think makes sense to get people together and sort of wrap your arms around one another again. It's what we have a history of doing, and it's what we need to get back to in order to deal with this addiction. And then we've got to be. There are lots of experts in this field. We just need to bring some of them into those community events and talk very openly about it. And we need to treat this as not as a crime, but as a health condition that needs to be resolved. It doesn't help to just someone who's addicted to put them in jail. They need treatment. It's like any other disease, and addiction is something that can be treated, but it takes a lot of time, energy, and money, and it takes a loving, caring community to really make that more successful.
Roger Johnson, National Farmers Union. We're talking about the suicide rate in agriculture, which is alarmingly high to the epidemic portion, and stressors of finances, opioid addiction have rippled into this issue. And just had one more question on that. Then I wanted to transition into energy and ag. But when I grew up in Sunday school teacher, altar boy, that sort of thing. Went to a Catholic school. And, of course, there we were part of the suicide. The word selfish came out quite a bit. And so I'm kind of programmed to think like that a lot of times. And so when we started talking about this, I started thinking about what happens next then, because we live in a world of insurances and land deeds and agricultural contracts. And without being insensitive here, there is a ripple that happens afterwards, isn't there?
Oh, of course, the huge ripple. And if, in fact, a death is determined to have been a suicide, most life insurance policies will not kick in. And so a lot of folks might think that, just ending it is the best way to save the farm, let's say. Well, if it's ruled a suicide, that's not the best way to save the farm. It just makes it that much worse, because now, this person who is an integral part of the operation is gone, and whoever is left behind has to pull the pieces together. For that reason, you see a lot of what are suspected suicides that may be farm accidents that, someone, well, I don't want to go into the details. You can imagine what they might be. And so there is this suspicion implies something a little bit more onerous than what I intend, but I'll use the word. There's this suspicion among a lot of the healthcare professionals and the folks who deal with farm stress and the suicides, that in fact the suicide rate in agriculture may be larger than what's already been described, because a number of what are suspected to have been suicides were ruled farm accidents. Yeah. So it's a big issue.
Yeah, boy. Well, let's switch gears here quickly and talk a little bit about ag and energy. And I'd like to just kind of approach at 5,000-foot view. You've been in agriculture for a long time. You've been in North Dakota, where they have had some energy activity come and go. You've probably witnessed everything from reclamation to spills along your days. So talk to me a little bit about what you guys from the farmers union and agricultural world, kind of that relationship.
Well, obviously you don't farm without fuel, and so there's a very direct connection there. One of the things that came out of the 80s was this enormous focus on the part of farmers on trying to add value to what they produce, because there was so much despair in the 80s related to markets and things like that. And there was this feeling that we really needed to take the commodities that we're producing and add value to them in some fashion, because that's where more profit frequently is found in a supply chain. And there are literally hundreds, it wouldn't be a stretch, I suppose, to say thousands of different things that were tried in terms of adding value to what we produce in agriculture. But the one that has been sort of a shining star, a great success story, has been the biofuels industry, where if you're talking about ethanol, it's taking corn, converting it into ethanol, and then taking that ethanol and adding it into gasoline. But that ethanol industry has really blossomed in this country, and in many ways has significantly helped the oil industry. And I'll come back to that in just a second, because it isn't just ethanol that's in this biofuels category. There's also biodiesel, which is taking oil products from soybeans. You take the soybean oil, or it might be canola oil, or any other crop that is an oil crop, and taking that oil and refining it in such a fashion that it's compatible with diesel fuel. And then you add that biofuel into the diesel fuel product, or you add the ethanol into gasoline. When I say that they have been a benefit to the oil industry, I think pretty much everyone in the oil industry would agree, but where we might disagree is at what point. Let me be more clear. One of the big challenges that the oil industry had relative to gasoline was how you add more octane to it. And if you take those products MTBE is a good example of one of these additives that some 3 decades ago or so was found to be a real problem. And it was leaching into groundwater, and it was also more expensive to add to gasoline than was ethanol. And so the industry very quickly accepted ethanol as an additive to gasoline that replaced some of those refined products that had, a number of sort of environmental concerns associated with them. And as long as it was at relatively low percentages, the oil industry was very openly embraced the addition of ethanol to gasoline. What's happened in recent years is the ethanol industry has really grown pretty dramatically and is now to the point where it's more than 10% of a gallon of gasoline. And so suddenly you've got the oil industry that's sort of rearing back and say, well, wait a minute, we thought this was just going to be an additive and that was fine. But when it gets to be even greater percentage of gasoline, the oil industry is tending to look at that as direct competition in what otherwise is a pretty concentrated, some would say a monopolistic kind of market in terms of having control over transportation fuels. And so there's that gets us to sort of present day where EPA is the federal agency that regulates the Clean Air Act, and ethanol being added into gasoline is covered through an amendment to the Clean Air Act called the Renewable Fuel Standard, and it presumed that there would be increasing amounts of ethanol and other biofuels added into the liquid transportation fuels in this country. And there is now this huge contention. Many of us in agriculture are arguing that we need to continue to add ethanol and other biofuels because the farm economy is in such tough shape. So that's certainly one of the reasons, but also because the fuel becomes cleaner and cleaner and better for the air and the environment as you add more of these biofuels to the oil industry. And so today it's sort of morphed into this debate that's even reached to the White House, and the president is negotiating with representatives of the oil industry and of the biofuels industry and trying to come to some sort of an agreement that makes them both happy, which is not an easy task. I mean, many of us in agriculture are saying we need to go to even higher blends of E15, E20, E30, because you get better and better performance, especially for these high compression engines, as you add more and more octane. So that's the spot we're at. The president has just announced that he plans to do year-round, to ask EPA to approve year-round sales of E15. It's one of the things the biofuels industry has been asking. But at the same time, you've got this big debate now that's swirling around because EPA Administrator Scott Pruitt has apparently been granting these small refiner waivers, which were intended to be for sort of economic distressed, very small refiners, and he's redefining that to be small refining plants, even though they might be owned by some of the most profitable and largest oil companies. So that's sort of at play out there as well.
Well, here's what I'm wondering is here we've got, I was glad to hear that there was some biofuels. We've gone beyond just ethanol. I mean, because I wrote down switchgrass because I remember 10 years ago switchgrass had more growing ability and whatever. It was one of the best per volume and price and everything. So the switchgrass represented diversity of biofuels because there has been a push over the last 5 years that I've seen firsthand with the oil and gas companies to diversify their portfolios, maybe into solar or maybe into wind or something like that. And then what I saw was the natural gas revolution happened, to where it's almost like they had to put their attention towards that because there was so much of it. And did that impact the biofuels innovation and technology? Because it did seem like things was going pretty good, but then it just seemed like that now I'm not hearing about the switchgrass anymore or anything like that.
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. We heard a lot about that, as you indicated, 10 years ago, even a bit further back than that. In fact, the renewable fuel standard, when it was passed in 2005 and then added to in 2007, contemplated corn-based ethanol being used up to a certain level, and then the balance of it was going to be cellulosic ethanol and other advanced biofuels. So biodiesel is an advanced biofuel. Cellulosic ethanol is something that would have been produced from switchgrass. And what happened was, and this is under the Obama administration, EPA became increasingly antagonistic toward the ethanol, the biofuel industry at large, and they did some things that added an enormous amount of uncertainty to companies that were trying to develop the technology to change switchgrass and other cellulosic materials into ethanol. And as a consequence, the R&D that was going into these plants, it just shriveled up. I mean, nobody's going to make a big investment if there's not some likelihood that you're going to be able to have a place in the market where you can sell whatever it is that you're producing. And so that R&D just almost overnight evaporated. It's still being used, cellulosic ethanol, but primarily where it's being produced right now is they're taking the corn. So when you take starch out of the corn kernel, you convert it to sugar and then you ferment it into ethanol. But another part of the corn kernel that remains is cellulosic material. So now Poet's really been a leader in this, and there's others that are using this technology now. They are converting that part of the kernel that was otherwise cellulose and then converted, sold as feed for livestock, and they're turning some of the cellulose out of that corn kernel into ethanol. It's a more complicated technology, but it gets really complicated when you are taking things like corn stover and as you're collecting it, maybe you're getting a bunch of dirt in the mix, and you start running things through the machinery that, I liken it to sort of combining and occasionally ingesting a large rock. That's not a good thing. And you have the same sort of problems that occur when you use products like corn stover or even switchgrass. You may occasionally roll up a rock in that switchgrass bale. And so you have to deal with that. All of those things just were a bit more costly. The technology was in its very early stages of development, and I think that part of the biofuels industry has just been much slower to mature for a number of those reasons that I've mentioned that then was anticipated when the RFS was first put in place.
Roger Johnson, National Farmers Union, spending quite a bit more time than we anticipated, so I thank you on that. And just kind of final question here. You brought up that monopolistic of essentially gasoline. Just like how the railroad essentially they've got the the rail monopoly. There are some monopolies out there. Newspapers. You go to,
Yep.
99.9% of the towns, and there's only one newspaper.
Yep.
Is there anybody out there, a Cummins or John Deere or Tesla, that is making a different form of transportation power, that is actually getting more towards? I know Ford was working on some natural gas cars for a while and that sort of thing. Is there any technology out there outside of the oil and gas companies that are making advancements to give us some diversity of powering liquid options?
Sure. So maybe a better way to phrase it is powering transportation, something that you can't just sort of plug in and use while it's plugged in. Probably the best example of that is your mentioning of Tesla and other companies that are producing electric vehicles. I think that's developed a bit more slowly than what was anticipated as well, because the real push for a lot of these things came when we were looking at $100+ crude. And that's not where that market is anymore. It's better than it was a few years ago, but it's still significantly cheaper than what was anticipated to be the case, and so that makes it more likely that we're going to continue to see more of these, oil-based forms of transportation fuel that are going to be around a lot longer than what some folks were predicting. But to that point, electric vehicles are really, there's a lot of R&D that's happening in that place, pretty much in all the spaces that you might anticipate, some very surprising. There are actually major manufacturers, John Deere and other tractor manufacturers that have produced all electric tractors. Now, they're not widespread at all. I don't even know that they're available on the market yet, but they've been produced. They're doing testing with them. I suspect there's going to have to be a fair amount of additional development, particularly around battery longevity, the ability to store larger amounts of power, and the ability to recharge rapidly. You're still seeing a lot of advancement in that space. Certainly the automobile industry, it's not all that unusual now to see at least hybrid vehicles, a lot of them on the market, and a number of all electric vehicles, and that's probably the biggest form of competition to the oil industry in terms of transportation fuel. Natural gas is certainly a component of it, but a lot of folks sort of see natural gas. I kind of see natural gas as being a petroleum product. I mean, it largely comes out of the same wells that you're producing oil from. There are some that are, predominantly natural gas wells, obviously, but it's common to see flares associated with oil wells, and so I think that a lot of folks sort of view natural gas, even though it might be cleaner and have other environmental attributes, it's nonetheless sort of a petrochemical product.
Oh yeah, they definitely go together. I mean, it's oil and gas is right in the same.
Yeah.
I mean, it's
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Well, just kind of final thoughts here. Anything that you want to reiterate? Anything that we left out? Anything? Go ahead.
I think my final thought here is that there's just a lot of stress in agriculture right now, and folks need to understand that. I think the challenge that we're facing right now in Washington, D.C. is how does Congress write a farm bill that's going to adequately address the economic pressure that farmers are feeling and facing right now. And so we've been sort of at the forefront of saying that Congress needs to find a way to put more money into a farm bill so they can address some of these dire economic circumstances, all of which sort of lead to where we started on this program, talking about suicide rates and opioid addictions and those sorts of things. I would just reiterate again the fact that in the last 5 years, net farm income has dropped by more than half. And that's a really, really big problem. When half of all the farmers and ranchers in this country are projected to have negative net farm income this year, you know you've got a real problem that needs to be addressed. And, the first part of solving a problem is recognizing a problem.